The winter of 1887 arrived in the Nevada mining town of Caldwell Flats with a particular kind of cruelty. Not the cruelty of blizzards or of hunger, but the slower cruelty of a man with money and a surveyor's plat deciding that a building other people had lived beside for 30 years was worth more as timber than his memory. Hector Grail had purchased the old county jailhouse on the 2nd day of December for $240. The lowest bid at a proceeding most of the town did not attend, and by the 3rd day he had filed with the territorial office to demolish it before the frost set deep enough to make digging difficult. The notice was posted on the door, condemned, authorized demolition pending, the letters printed in the flat black ink of bureaucratic finality. Nora Voss read that notice on the morning of December 4th, standing in the cold with her breath clouding around the brim of her wool hat, and she read it the way her father had taught her to read any official document. Twice through for what it said, once more for what it did not say. Her father, August Voss, had been the county's only surveyor and unofficial keeper of deeds for 19 years before a mining accident took him in the spring of 1884. He had taught Nora the work from the time she was 12, beginning with how to read plat lines and boundary descriptions, how to trace title chains through territorial transfer records, and how to find the gaps and elisions that careless men left in paperwork they assumed no one would ever examine again. He had given her his drafting tools when his hands grew unsteady. In his last winter, a set of brass-handled dividers, a chamfered straight edge, and a magnifying loop on a cord, and she still wore the loop around her neck on the cord he had spliced the leather worn smooth against her sternum. He had told her more than once that the most dangerous document in any territory was not the one with the most words on it, but the one with the fewest. The gaps were where the theft lived. Nora had been working as a copyist and record keeper at the assay office for 2 years, since her father's death had left her the small house on Creek Road and almost nothing else. She was 26 years old, and she knew the deed records of Caldwell Flats better than anyone living, including the territorial clerk who was supposed to maintain them. She had not intended to become involved in Hector Grail's purchase. She had, in fact, intended to mind her own affairs. But the notice on the door had not sat right, and she had stood in the cold for 4 minutes reading it. And when a thing did not sit right after 4 minutes of attention, her father had taught her to find out why. The old jailhouse had been built in 1861 by a man named Edwin Pratt, who had been the first county sheriff and who had also, in the years before the county was formally organized, run the only reliable assay operation within 2 days' ride. The building was a low-slung structure of dressed sandstone blocks with a timber-framed roof, 2 cells at the back and a narrow office at the front, and it had served as jailhouse, assay station, and unofficial courthouse for 11 years before the county built proper facilities elsewhere. Edwin Pratt had died in 1872, and the building had passed through several hands and several uses, serving at different times as a grain storage facility, a telegraph relay office, and most recently as a storage annex for the land office next door. It had been vacant for 4 years when Grail bought it. What Nora knew, and what she did not think Grail knew, was that Edwin Pratt had been conducting an independent assay of a disputed mining claim in the weeks before his death, and that the results of that assay had never been formally recorded. The claim had belonged to a family named Whitmore. The Whitmore heirs had spent 15 years trying to locate the missing documentation, and Grail had spent the better part of a decade quietly buying up the parcels surrounding the disputed ground at prices that reflected their apparent worthlessness, which was to say, and prices that assumed the Whitmore claim was invalid because the assay proof had vanished. The jailhouse floor was made of timber planks over a stone subfloor, and the timber planks were original to the 1861 construction. Nora's father had told her, once in the particular offhand way he had, When he was telling her something important, he did not want to announce as important that Edwin Pratt had been a man who did not trust safes. He trusted stone and he trusted depth. He had built his own subfloor and he had done the work himself in the evenings when the building was empty and the town was busy with its own concerns. A father had said this to her in the winter of 1882, when she was 17, when they had been walking past the jailhouse on their way to the land office, and she had asked why the building sat so low on its foundation compared to the one beside it. He had paused and looked at it and said what he said, and then they had walked on, and she had filed it in the particular part of her mind where she kept things that did not yet connect to anything, but felt as though they would. In the winter of 1887, with 14 days before Grayle's demolition crew arrived, they connected. Grayle's demolition permit was valid in 14 days. She had counted. Nora spent the first 2 days confirming what she suspected. She pulled the original construction records from the land office. Archive, a task she was entitled to perform in her capacity as assay office copyist, and she compared the timber floor dimensions in the 1861 building plan against the sandstone foundation plan filed 3 years later when Pratt had applied for a water drainage variance. The timber floor was 14 inches shallower in the building plan than the foundation plan required. 14 inches was not a construction error. 14 inches was a decision. She laid the two documents side by side on the copy table and studied them under the afternoon light from the land office window, and she worked through the arithmetic twice, and both times the arithmetic gave her the same answer. The foundation plan described a cavity below the timber floor. The building plan did not describe it. Someone had filed the building plan first, and the foundation plan 3 years later, and either the foundation plan was in error or the building plan was incomplete, and the building plan had been filed by the county, and the foundation plan had been filed by Pratt himself, and Edwin Pratt had been meticulous to a degree that the county had never matched. She rolled the documents and returned them to their slots, and said nothing to the clerk who passed her in the doorway on his way out. She did not tell anyone what she had found. She went home that evening and ate her supper, and cleaned her father's dividers with a rag and tallow, and thought about what the work would cost her in time and in standing. Grayle was not a man who accepted interference quietly. He had arrived in Caldwell Flats 6 years ago with territorial connections and a surveyor's eye for undervalued land, and he had methodically assembled a portfolio of parcels that everyone else had overlooked or dismissed. He presented his acquisitions as good business sense and market timing, and the county treated them as such because the county had never had reason to look behind the transfer documents at the pattern they form. He was polite in the way that powerful men are polite when they do not yet need to be otherwise. He had a way of letting silences extend that functioned as a kind of pressure without anything being said. She thought about the Whitmore family. There was one Whitmore left in Caldwell Flats, a woman named Cecilia, who was 61 years old and who had watched her family's claim get dismissed, misrecorded, and quietly absorbed into Grayle's holdings over the course of 15 years. Cecilia Whitmore had filed 3 separate petitions with the Territorial Recording Office during that time, each one requesting a review of the original claim documentation, and each one had been returned with a notation that the claim lacked sufficient documentary support for review. She lived on what had once been the edge of her family's ground, in a house that sat on a parcel Grayle did not own yet. Though Nora had seen the offered documents in the land office and knew he was moving toward it, the same slow, methodical movement he applied to everything he acquired. Nora had spoken to Cecilia Whitmore twice, in the ordinary way of a small town, once at the general store when they were both waiting for a parcel, and once at a town meeting about the water rights to the South Fork, a meeting at which Grayle had also been present, seated in the front row with his surveyor's bearing and his careful silence. Nora had noticed at that meeting that Cecilia Whitmore sat in the back row and watched Grail with the particular attention of a woman who had learned to watch rather than speak, because speaking had not, so far, accomplished very much. Nora had recognized that attention. She had learned it from her father, who had told her that the most useful thing a surveyor could do at any public proceeding was to stay very still and pay attention to who was not talking. On the third morning, Nora went to the assay office, asked her supervisor for a 3-day absence citing a surveying errand for the estate of a deceased client, which was true in spirit if not in the precise details he imagined, and she walked across town to the condemned jailhouse with her father's tool roll under her arm. She had obtained the key from the land office clerk on the grounds that she needed to inventory the storage contents before demolition, which was also approximately true. The door opened inward on a hinge that had been oiled recently, which told her that Grail or someone in his employ had been inside. The front office smelled of cold stone and old paper, and something underneath those things, something dry and mineral and sealed. The smell of a space that had been closed for a long time before someone had recently opened it and not found what they expected to find. There were boot prints in the dust near the entrance, 2 sets, large and male, the tread of working boots that had been resoled once. They had walked the front office and the 2 back cells, and they had stopped at the timber floor of the front office, and she could see where someone had crouched and run a finger along one of the plank joints, and then stood up and left without doing anything further. Whoever Grail had sent had not known what they were looking for. That was something. She set her father's tool roll on the deputy's old desk and unrolled it across the surface, and stood for a long time looking at the floor without touching it. The desk itself was a broad piece of scarred pine, the top worn to a pale silver gray from years of elbows and ledger books, and the tools rolled out across it in their proper order: flat chisel and narrow chisel, small hammer, palette knife, pry bar no longer than 14 inches, brass folding rule. Her father had assembled this roll over 30 years of surveying work, and he had not carried anything in it that did not earn its place. She had not added anything to it, and had not removed anything from it, and she did not intend to. The timber floor was laid in wide planks of Douglas fir, and they had aged to a dark amber gray, the surface worn smooth by decades of boot leather and hard use. Her father had taught her that the first thing you did with any piece of ground you needed to understand was to look at it from a distance before you touched it. You let your eyes do what your hands would want to rush through. You looked for the thing that was slightly wrong. The front office was 12 feet from north to south and 9 feet from east to west. The planks ran north to south in rows of varying widths, the widest plank near the west wall about 14 inches across, the narrower planks toward the east wall 7 or 8 inches, the way old timber floors were laid when you used what the mill gave you rather than what you ordered. She looked at each plank in turn, starting at the north wall and working south, letting her eye move the way it moved when she examined a deed page, not reading for what was there, but scanning for what was inconsistent. She saw it in the 4th plank from the west wall. The grain of the fir ran north to south in every plank except that one, where it ran east to west for about 18 inches before the natural grain reasserted itself. It was a repair. Someone had cut into that plank and replaced a section of it, and they had done a careful job, but they had not been able to source a piece of fir whose grain ran the same direction as the original, and so the repair was visible if you were looking for inconsistency rather than for damage. She went and stood over it with the loop to her eye. The joint lines on the repaired section were clean and tight, tighter than the surrounding plank joints, because the original builder had been working with green wood that had shrunk as it cured over decades, while the repaired section had been set in when it was already aged and dry. The nails in the surrounding planks had been set with a square head, common in the 1860 seconds. The nails in the repaired section were round-headed, 1870 seconds manufacture. The repair had been made sometime after 1872 and before the building stopped being used in any active way, which placed it in a narrow window of years. She knelt and measured the repaired section with the folding rule, 18 inches by 22. She measured the surrounding plank joints and compared them. The standard joint gap in the aged original planks had widened to nearly 1/16 of an inch through decades of expansion and contraction, while the repaired section's joint to the surrounding planks was nearly flush, the fit of a piece installed dry into a space that had opened somewhat with time and then closed somewhat against it. The way wood and stone behave across seasons. She recorded the measurements in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket, the same pocket-sized notebook she used for deed annotations and parcel descriptions, writing down the numbers in her father's abbreviations without thinking about it, because the abbreviations were the ones he had taught her and she had never replaced them with her own. She understood what she was looking at. She had understood it at some level since she had stood outside on December 4th reading the demolition notice. The understanding was not a sudden thing. It was the arrival of a fact that had been traveling toward her for a while. She knew what that window meant. The work took most of the first day, which surprised her somewhat, because she had expected the floor to resist more than it did. The chisel found the joint lines of the repaired section without difficulty, and she worked it carefully, tapping with the small hammer at a measured pace, not driving but feeling, the way her father had taught her to feel through a tool rather than push against it. The repaired section was about 18 inches by 22, and it came up in 2 pieces, because whoever had cut it had angled the edges so they fitted into the surrounding planks without nails, a socket joint rather than a nailed repair. She lifted the 2 pieces clear and set them against the wall. Below the fur was a layer of compressed burlap, brown and dry and odorless, packed in smooth, with no lumps or gaps. She lifted the burlap with a palette knife, rolling it to one side, and beneath it was a sandstone cap fitted to the subfloor cavity with the same precision she had seen in Pratt's construction records. Dressed edges, no mortar at the seams, the stone cut to fit the cavity so closely that the fit itself was the seal. The cap was a single piece of sandstone, roughly 24 inches by 16 and perhaps 3 inches thick. She estimated its weight at 40 pounds. She examined its surface with the loop under the light coming through the west-facing window, which lay in a cold, flat band across the floor at this hour of the afternoon. There was a tool mark in the upper left corner of the stone, a small chiseled divot, triangular, the mark of a left-handed man working a right-handed tool. You could see it in the angle of the cut, the way the strike came from the right side of the triangle, and the force had driven left, which was the opposite of what a right-handed man produced. Her father had told her that Pratt was left-handed. It was the kind of detail that surveyors accumulated, the particular record of other men's markings that accumulated in a life spent reading the physical evidence of other people's work. She sat back on her heels and rested for a moment. The cold in the building had settled into her knees and her hands, and the light through the west window was dropping. She still had to lift the cap, and she still had to close everything back up before she left, and she had not yet eaten since morning. She ate the bread and dried meat she had brought in her coat pocket and drank water from the bottle she had filled at the hand pump on Creek Road, and she thought about the geometry of lifting the cap without cracking it. The subfloor around it was sandstone as well, and she needed a pivot point that would not gouge the surrounding stone when she levered against it. She folded the burlap into a pad and placed it at the near edge of the cap, set the tip of the short pry bar against it, and applied force in a slow, steady arc. Not a sudden push, but a gradual increase in pressure that let the stone find its own moment of release. The cap shifted. She eased the pressure, and it settled. She adjusted the pivot point 2 inches toward the center and tried again, and this time the cap came clear on the near side, tilting up at an angle that let her get both hands under the far edge, and she walked it out of its socket and set it flat on the floor beside her, with a care that cost her the better part of the remaining strength in her wrist. Below the cap was a cavity cut into the subfloor, roughly the dimensions of a leather valise, and perhaps 10 inches deep. The stone walls of the cavity were smooth-cut, deliberate, the work of a man who had prepared this space with the same precision he brought to his assay scales. The cavity was dry. The air that rose from it when the cap came clear was cold and still and faintly mineral, the air of a sealed space. And she breathed it in carefully and noted that it carried no rot, no moisture, no damage. Inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed along every seam with red wax, was a bundle the size of a large ledger book. She did not open it there. She lifted it with both hands and held it for a moment to feel its weight, and it was solid and dense, and the oilcloth was still supple after 15 years, which meant the wax had held and the cavity had been dry throughout. She wrapped it in the burlap and placed it in her father's tool roll and closed the roll and set it against the wall. Then she replaced the stone cap, working it back into its socket with the same patience she had used. To remove it, checking the fit on each side before she pressed it flush. She unfolded the burlap pad and laid it flat over the stone. She replaced the 2 sections of timber plank, pressing them into their socket joints until they seated without gap. She swept the chisel dust from the surrounding planks with the edge of her sleeve and examined the floor from the doorway. It looked as it had when she had arrived. She relocked the jailhouse and walked home in the early dark of December, the tool roll over her shoulder, the bundle inside it, and she did not look at anyone she passed on the main street, and no one who saw her saw anything particular to note. She opened the bundle at her kitchen table that evening, with one lamp lit and the curtain drawn across the west window. The oilcloth peeled back from the wax seams without tearing, the wax having kept its bond through 15 Nevada winters. The contents were dry and perfectly preserved. She laid them out in the order they emerged. First came a surveyor's field book in Edwin Pratt's hand, 43 pages of field notes for the Whitmore claim recorded across 4 visits to the site in October and November of 1872. A set of formal assay records on heavy bond paper, the ore samples numbered and weighed and tested in the careful tabular format the Territorial Recording Office required, and a folded document that was the formal assay certification for the Whitmore mining claim dated November 14, 1872, signed in Pratt's clear blocky script, stamped with the county surveyor's seal, and recording an ore yield figure that established the claim as commercially viable beyond any reasonable contest. It was addressed to no one in the manner of a man who expected to file it formally and did not survive to do so. The handwriting was the same measured script as the field book, unhurried, the hand of a man who was not afraid but was being careful. He had written in that same measured hand that he had reason to believe the document would not reach the county recorder through ordinary channel. The party opposing the claim, he wrote, had connections to the recording office and had made clear the filing would not proceed without difficulties. He could not overcome through direct submission. He was placing the original certification in field record in safekeeping until he could arrange a reliable witness for the filing, or until a person with the standing and the knowledge to present it correctly came to the building and understood what the floor was telling them. He had not arranged the witness in time. He had died 18 days after the certification was dated, in a hunting accident on the north rim of the canyon, alone, on a day when there was no particular reason for him to be anywhere near the north rim. The inquest had returned a verdict of accidental death, and no one had looked behind the verdict because the man who would have known where to look was the man who was dead. Nora sat with the letter for a long time. The lamp between her and the documents gave a warm, close light, and outside the frost was pressing hard against the window glass, and she sat and did not rush herself. The opposing party was not named in the letter. She did not need the letter to name him. She had spent 2 years reading deed records, and she knew Hector Grail's title chains the way she knew the plat maps she used every week, and she could trace the parcel transfers that had relied on the Whitmore claim being unenforceable. And she knew the dates those transfers had occurred, and what they had cost, and what Grail had resold them for, and what remained in his current holdings. She could see the shape of what he had built. The bearing and distance, the recorded fact, the thing that was either true or was not. She spent the following day at the assay office, working through her lunch and into the early afternoon, preparing a formal summary of the chain of title affecting the Whitmore parcels. She cross-referenced every transfer against the county deed book and the territorial plat records, pulling the original instruments and comparing their language against the certification in Pratt's field book, annotating each gap where a transfer had assumed the invalidity of a claim that was in fact properly certified and simply missing from the record. The work required going back to 1869, to the Whitmore family's original filing, and tracing forward through every transfer and contest and petition, and she did not rush any of it because the summary she was building had to be without error, to be without challenge. And she owed it that much to the work Pratt had done, alone, in his building in November of 1872. Her supervisor asked her twice what she was working on, and she told him she was preparing a record summary for a title dispute, which was true, and he did not ask further, because he was a man who trusted her work and had learned not to ask about processes he would not understand. She sent a brief note to Cecilia Whitmore on the evening of the second day, plain and direct, saying only that she had found something the woman had been looking for. Come when you are able. She had not said more than that in writing, because a letter was a thing someone else could read, and she had learned from her father that you did not put the substance of a thing in a letter until the substance was safely in hand. Cecilia Whitmore came to her door on the evening of the 5th day. She was a tall woman, lean and straight-backed in the way of people who have spent years maintaining their posture against the weight of being repeatedly told they are wrong. She came in from the cold and unwound her scarf and sat at the kitchen table when Nora indicated the chair. And she did not speak while she settled herself, and Nora recognized that quality as she recognized it in her father, the quality of a person who had learned not to spend words until there was something to spend them on. Nora placed the assay certification in front of her first, then the field book, opened to the first entry for the Whitmore claim in October of 1872, then the letter, then the chain of title summary with the parcel transfers annotated. She had arranged them in the order of their bearing on the question, and she let Cecilia read without commentary. The older woman read the certification twice, the field book for a longer time, her finger moving down the columns of Pratt's careful numbers. She read the letter once, and set it down and looked at the opposite wall for a moment. Then she went back to the certification and read it a third time. She set her hands flat on the table. "Where was it?" she said. "Under the floor," Nora said. "He hid it to protect it. He did not survive to retrieve it. Grail would have torn through that building in a week." "Yes," Nora said. "He would not have known to look. He would have pulled the floor out and sold the timber, and the stone would have gone for fill." "Yes," Nora said again. He would not have known to look because he knew the certification was missing, and he believed what was missing stayed missing. Cecilia Whitmore looked at the certification for a long time. The lamp on the table between them put a warm, unsteady light on the papers, and outside the frost was settling hard into the ground. My father filed for that claim in 1869. My mother spent 11 years trying to get it recognized. I spent 15. She paused. My mother went to the recording office 4 separate times. I know, Nora said. I read the petition records. They told her each time that the claim lacked documentation. It did not lack documentation, Nora said. The documentation was where Pratt put it, waiting for someone who read floors. Cecilia said nothing for a moment. Then she picked up the letter again and read the passage about the person with the standing and the knowledge, who would eventually come to the building and understand what the floor was telling them. She folded it back along its crease and set it down. What do we do with it? She said. We file it, Nora said. Monday morning, Territorial Recorder's Office, with the chain of title summary I have prepared, and a sworn statement from you about the history of the family's attempts to register the claim. The certification is original, and it is dated, and it carries the county seal, and it is signed by the county surveyor of record. There is nothing ambiguous about it. The recording office will have to accept it or explain why they will not, and the explanation will be more interesting than the filing. Grail will contest. He may, Nora said. He will need to explain how a claim he has been treating as invalid for a decade carries a properly executed certification by Edwin Pratt. The contest will require him to argue against a document he presumably did not know existed, which is a different position than the one he has occupied for 10 years. Cecilia Whitmore looked at her across the table. The look had something in it that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but some third quality that was closer to recognition, the acknowledgement that one careful woman offers another when the work has been done correctly and the care shows in the work itself rather than in any announcement of it. Your father was a good surveyor, she said. He was, Nora said. He taught me to read for what a document doesn't say. The filing took place on a Monday morning in the second week of December in the small stone building that served as the Territorial Recorder's Office in Caldwell Flats, before a clerk who examined the documentation with the particular careful attention of a man who understood that what he was holding was going to make his day considerably more complicated than he had planned. The original certification was genuine. The wax seal matched the impression on file in the territorial record of Pratt's official seal, which the clerk confirmed himself by pulling the impression from the archive while Nora and Cecilia Whitmore waited across the counter. The chain of title summary was precise and cross-referenced. The sworn statement was clear. There was nothing for the clerk to do but stamp and record. He stamped and recorded. He also, and this she had not expected, wrote a brief notation in the margin of the intake log to the effect that the documentation presented was of an unusual character and had been confirmed against the official seal record, which she understood to be his way of creating a record of his own caution in the event that the filing was contested. She recognized the instinct. It was the instinct of a careful man in a position who understood that powerful people sometimes blamed their instruments. He thanked him, and she and Cecilia Whitmore walked back out into the December cold, and Cecilia said nothing for 2 blocks, and then she said, her voice even and flat, he had the seal record there. He did, Nora said. Pratt filed his seal impression in 1861, the year he built the building, Nora said. Cecilia Whitmore looked ahead at the main street of Caldwell Flats, the storefronts and the freight office and the hotel. The ordinary landscape of a town that had been conducting its business on a flawed foundation for 15 years. My mother would have walked down this street every day, she said. Every day for 11 years. Nora did not answer, because there was nothing to say to that which would not diminish it. Grail's demolition permit expired without the demolition being executed. The territory placed a hold on the site pending resolution of the filing, and the jailhouse stood through the winter and into the spring, while the documentation was examined and the claim was adjudicated by the Territorial Review Board. Grail hired a territorial attorney from the capital, a man known for his success in land dispute proceedings, and the attorney examined Pratt's certification and the field book and the chain of title summary in a room at the land office, and then conferred with Grail privately for a considerable period. What was said in that room was not recorded. What followed was a notice of withdrawal of opposition filed with the Territorial Board, which was the legal way of acknowledging that the case against the Whitmore claim had dissolved on contact with Edwin Pratt's documentation. The Whitmore parcels were formally re-registered in Cecilia Whitmore's name in April of 1888. The ore claim was licensed to a working operation by that summer. Modest in its yield, but sound and properly recorded, the proceeds of the first working year settled the debt that had accumulated against the house on the edge of the family's former ground over the better part of a decade. Grail left Caldwell Flats the following winter. He did not make a formal departure, which was the choice of a man whose departure was not something he wished to announce. He liquidated what he could through a land broker in the territorial capital, and his name stopped appearing in the deed records of Caldwell Flats, which was the same as leaving, in a place where presence was measured by what you owned and what you had filed. The jailhouse was not torn down. The county, after some deliberation among people who understood what it had held, purchased the building from Grail's estate account at fair market value and deeded it to the town as a public archive for territorial records, which was perhaps the most fitting second life a building could have. Place that had once hidden a record, becoming the place that kept records for everyone who needed them. Nora Voss was hired as the town's first formal archivist in the spring of 1888, at a salary set by the county board that was not generous and not an insult, and she set up her work table in the front office of the old jailhouse, in the same room where she had spent December on her knees with a chisel and a palette knife and a loop and her father's patients. She brought the record books from the assay office archive and the land office auxiliary files, and arranged them on the shelves she had the carpenter build along the north wall, organized by date and by parcel, in the order her father had taught her, each volume with a small paper label in her careful hand. The subfloor cavity was sealed with mortar she had mixed herself from lime, and fine sand pressed into the joints, with the palette knife from her father's row, the stone cap set back in its socket for the last time and bedded solid. The repaired timber section fit the same as it always had. You would not know, to look at it, that it had ever been opened. But you would know, if you read floors, that someone had once understood exactly what the floor was holding, and had trusted that the right person would eventually read it. She kept her father's dividers, and his straight edge and his loop, on the corner of the work table, the loop on its original cord. The leather of the cord was worn at the back of her neck to a smoothness that was familiar in the way that small inheritances become familiar, present without announcing themselves. The particular weight of a thing carried long enough to feel like part of the body. She had thought about replacing the cord in the spring and had not replaced it, and she understood that she probably would not. The archive opened on a Thursday in late April, the light coming in at a low angle through the west-facing window and falling in warm flat bands across the plank floor. The records of Caldwell Flats, the plat books, and the deed registers, and the assay logs, going back to 1858, were arranged on the shelves along the north wall, available to anyone who needed to read them. What Pratt had understood working alone in the cold of November 1872 with no witness he could trust and a short window of time was that a document placed correctly could outlast the man who placed it. The right container was everything. The right container was stone, and depth and sealed wax, and the confidence that someone would eventually come with the right inheritance and the right patience and read what the floor was telling them. Now, she placed her hand flat on the planks when she thought of this. The wood was cool and solid beneath her palm, and the stone below it was sealed and settled, and the work the cavity had done was finished, the record out in the light and properly filed, and no longer in need of hiding. The floor that had kept the secret was now just a floor again, ordinary and quiet, doing what floors do. That was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. If you have ever watched a piece of paper outlast the man who tried to bury it, leave a word for Nora in the comments. For another story of a frontier woman and the hidden thing the world nearly threw away. The next one is waiting just ahead. This is a work of historical fiction. Characters, events, and institutions are invented for this story. Any resemblance to actual historical persons or records is coincidental.